Good morning again. It was such a pleasure to be able to introduce Matt this morning, but behind every great man there are at least two ladies, and I wanted to take this moment to acknowledge on behalf of all of us who I think are having a wonderful time, Kathy Drake, the newest employee of the Decorative Arts Trust, and Christina Gray, who have made things flow seamlessly. What you don't know is that you get a schedule that says what's happening. We get a schedule that, oh my gosh, you could run a European defensive. It is a wartime game plan, and I get up in the morning and think, oh my God, what's happening at 7:30? And then I say, oh, it's Kathy Drake goes to the French truck at 217 Charters to pick up coffee service with the assistance of. Then I think, oh good, I don't have to appear till 9:15. But behind, I assure you, they are up and at it long before you rise and long after you have gone to bed or to Bourbon Street, depending on your proclivities. I will also mention, and I know so many of my friends think that I need to go to an Instagram 12-step program, and that may come, but it is nice when you're having a bad day and think nobody loves me, and then you just turn on your phone and go, oh my God, 500 people loved me today. I mean, not in that way. They like my pictures. But Christina looks after the Decorative Arts Trust Instagram account, and after she thanked me for mentioning Instagram as a great way to keep up with the Trust, she says, during the course of this conference, the Decorative Arts Trust has gained 100 new followers. So that is, yay. That is the power of social media, and we all have to keep up with it because it will leave us in the dust if we don't. Well, what a pleasure to introduce another emerging scholar, and this is the recipient of the Marie Zimmermann Emerging Scholar Endowed Lecture. Maggie Dimock is Curator of Collections and Exhibitions at the Alva Maggie Chapel Art Center at St. Anselm College. She's a curator and art historian specializing in 19th and 20th century ceramic and textile traditions in North America. As curator of collections and exhibitions at the Alva Maggie Chapel Art Center, she manages contemporary art exhibitions and curates a permanent collection of fine and decorative arts objects. She's also engaged in research and conservation consultations as part of an initiative to restore and interpret the historic 1924 chapel that serves as the center's exhibition space. Maggie previously held positions as a research fellow with the Nichols House Museum, a textile cataloging assistant at Winterthur Museum, and as curator of art collections for the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. She holds an MA in History of Decorative Art from the Corcoran College of Art and Design and the Smithsonian Associates. And today she takes us on another New Orleans adventure, and her lecture is titled A Lover of the Beautiful, Harriet Joor, Newcomb Pottery, and the Arts and Crafts Movement. Please welcome Maggie Dimock.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, Tom. And I just want to echo my thanks to the staff and the whole team at the Decorative Arts Trust for such a lovely time here in New Orleans, for such a great show of hospitality. It's been wonderful to be here. As Tom said, I'm here to speak about the topic of the Newcomb enterprise, or the Newcomb pottery. We sometimes use the term enterprise to be a little bit more encompassing of the full panoply of craft activities that were taking place at Newcomb, which of course included metalwork, needlework, bookbinding, and as many of us maybe learned for the first time if we were on a tour of the New Orleans Museum of Art yesterday, it also included leaded glass lampshades. Just change the slide here. Although I now work in New Hampshire, the college and the art gallery where I serve as the curator for collections is in Manchester, New Hampshire, I have had an opportunity to return to research about both Harriet Joor, a Newcomb artisan from the very earliest days of the pottery, and the sort of topic of the Newcomb enterprise in general, frequently over the last few years. And so, in fact, most recently, just before I started, I thought I'd mention that I'd heard just the week before last from the curatorial staff at the Hilliard University Museum at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, who holds a collection of papers, basically drawings and botanical drawings related to Harriet Joor. That they're right now seeking funding basically for a major conservation initiative to conserve those works and hopefully interpret them and do some more exhibition work with them in the future, which was really wonderful to hear. So while I'm coming to this certainly sort of as a scholar of a particular artisan, I'm going to begin a little bit with a broader discussion of the Newcomb enterprise in general. So typically we know that the Newcomb enterprise is a craft enterprise, a pottery enterprise that's positioning itself as a quintessentially Southern initiative, right? One that's tied to New Orleans, tied to the Gulf Coast, both by virtue of its location and also the very distinctive decorative motifs, which evoke this romanticized version of the Louisiana bayou. What I'll be discussing is that the motivation for this enterprise and its design aesthetics really owe just as much, if not more, to contemporary expressions of the burgeoning arts and crafts movement, specifically those that are percolating in New England at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And truly, in order to understand the legacy and the success and the context of this Newcomb enterprise, it's necessary to grasp the role that Newcomb played in this larger picture of the American arts and crafts movement. Not only were the founding faculty of the Newcomb Art Department themselves educated in New England, but as we'll see, for many of these early Newcomb pottery artists, a critical aspect of their design education involved study in New York and in New England itself, especially as we'll see the Ipswich Summer School, which was founded by Arthur Wesley Dow in Ipswich, Massachusetts. Now, before I go any further, I will acknowledge that I see the irony of someone like myself coming from New Hampshire and making a claim that this very distinctive New Orleans art pottery enterprise owes everything it is to New England education. And I will say, maybe just to defend myself, I'm a New England transplant myself, which is to say I grew up south of Baltimore, so I'm from south of the Mason-Dixon line, even if just barely. And certainly this isn't to discredit, the craftswomen themselves or the potters that were associated with the pottery enterprise. More so, I think this is reflective, and I would argue it's reflective of the relative prosperity of Northern American cities in the post-Civil War era, especially compared to those in the South. And relatedly, seeing the proliferation of institutions of higher education, increased industrial production in northern cities, the subsequent need for industrial design education in the North. This all compared to the relative economic depression of the South in that same period. So after all, one thing to remember is that really the stated impetus for the foundation of the Newcomb enterprise was to educate Southern women, to enable them to learn skills that would potentially give them a means for supporting themselves. And as we'll see in the case of Harriet Joor, the professional ties that Newcomb artists were able to make with other artists and schools, especially outside of the South and in regions like New England, could potentially serve as a springboard for future opportunities beyond Newcomb pottery. But what I'll do is begin with a bit of orientation to the history of the Newcomb enterprise, and to do that I'd like to sort of travel back to the mid-1880s to two sort of important events in late 19th century New Orleans. One is the occasion of the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition, which was held in 1884, and the other is the foundation of Newcomb College 2 years later in 1886. Begin with the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition, this was a World's Fair event that was intended really to showcase the industrial potential and power of the South at a time, again, that was just 2 decades after the Civil War. It was scheduled to celebrate the first commodity shipment of cotton from the South in 1784. Now, the women's department of the fair was organized by the prominent author, poet, and social activist Julia Ward Howe, and these exhibits that were on view in the women's department largely consisted of art and craft items that were produced by female artists, many of them from northern educational institutions. So this included examples of embroidery, china painting, hammered metal, wood carving, bookbindery, and ceramic examples. These displays were incredibly popular, and the popularity really led to the fair organizers deciding that it was crucial to offer courses to the young women of New Orleans in these craft enterprises. And so a pair of brothers, Ellsworth and William Woodward, were hired to teach these courses. Both of the Woodward brothers had graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design just a few years earlier. The courses were so popular that they continued well beyond the conclusion of the fair, and just over a year later, when Newcomb College was first opening its doors, the school's administrators decided that it was important enough to have an art department as part of this new educational initiative for young women. So the Woodward brothers themselves were hired as faculty for the new Newcomb College, and a third art professor, Gertrude Robert Smith, who was a graduate of the Massachusetts Normal School of Art, was also added to the faculty. And so at this point, we have a small college with a faculty of only 9, 3 of whom are art professors. Now, to give some background, the Newcomb College had been established with a financial gift from Mrs. Louise Lemonnier Newcomb. This is the wealthy widow of a New York industrialist and businessman. The intention was to found an educational institution for young women in the Gulf South, specifically young white women, we should recognize. And this was in memory of her daughter, Harriet Sophie Newcomb, who sadly had died in 1870 from diphtheria at the age of only 15. The H. Sophie Newcomb Memorial College was America's first degree-granting coordinate college for women. It was associated with Tulane, but from the beginning, it operated as an independent institution. It had a separate campus, a separate set of faculty. This, of course, is not the case any longer. The institution, over the years, gradually changed campuses. Eventually, in 1918, built a new campus that was adjacent to the Tulane campus itself, and then following Hurricane Katrina in 2006, was actually formally absorbed into Tulane. And exists really in name only now. There's a wonderful art museum, the Newcomb Art Museum, which has a beautiful collection of Newcomb pottery in addition to doing contemporary art shows, which is really one of the lasting legacies of Newcomb today. Now, the idea of a pottery enterprise at Newcomb College was first raised in 1893. Ellsworth Woodward was writing later about the decision that he felt, quote, a business had to be founded, such a business as would furnish employment for those trained and qualified, and which should exhibit an object lesson in the possibilities underlying the native raw materials when trained talent takes it in hand and stamps it for beauty and use. The first courses in pottery and ornamentation began in 1895, and this really marks the beginning of the Newcomb pottery enterprise. The college hired a professional ceramicist. This is Joseph Fortune Meyer on our left. Meyer was a French potter. He was from a family of French potters who had immigrated, and he was living in Biloxi, Mississippi. And when he was first brought into the Newcomb enterprise, he brought his very good friend, the fellow potter George Orr, who many of you who are familiar with American studio ceramics will know as the self-styled Mad Potter of Biloxi. One can only assume that the administration at Newcomb found Orr to be a little bit too eccentric for their tastes, so he didn't last very long. But Joseph Fortune Meyer was really the long-term potter for the enterprise, retiring only in 1930. And this, of course, brings up a crucial concept that's often discussed with Newcomb pottery, and that is the stark division of labor along gender lines. So, of course, we have male potters who are actually throwing the clay vessels, and then female decorators who are working on the surface decoration. There is some evidence that at least in the very early days of the pottery, female students were receiving some sort of instruction in clay modeling, whether that was throwing on the wheel or hand building. And there was some experimentation with high fire glazes. So for example, we have on the left, on your left I should say, these two vases from the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, at least one of which is thought to have been thrown and probably glazed as well by the Newcomb artist Selina Brez. Other early experimental wares utilized techniques like sgraffito decoration, in which a colored glaze would have been applied to the surface and then carefully carved away to reveal a decorative pattern. However, for the most part, very quickly, the Newcomb enterprise settled on a particular decorative scheme that featured intricately painted surface decoration, this demonstrating a very clear debt to 19th century China painting. The decorative motifs were, as a rule, derived from natural forms, primarily plants and flowers, especially those that were associated with the southern Bayou region. Now, beginning with vessels dated to about 1900, we can observe a much greater tendency for conventionalization in the design work. Often we have botanical forms that have been flattened, that have been stylized, elongated, or shrunk specifically to suit the shape of the vessel in which they're placed. Newcomb decorators at this time made many, many more references, most likely to some of the common sources of design ornament at the time. For example, Owen Jones' Grammar of Ornament from 1956. And we know, for example, in a copy, there's still a copy of the Tulane Library of volume Midley's Book of Studies in Plant Form, which dealt particularly with the adaptation of floral forms to ornamental surfaces. Now, perhaps most significantly, the Newcomb pottery from this period reflects the influence of a design instruction book that was published in 1889 by the artist and educator Arthur Wesley Dow, titled simply Composition. Now, this text basically was sort of the culmination of years of study, concepts and design ideas derived from Arthur Wesley Dow's study of Japanese woodblock prints. This is a crucial text that proposed methods of composing decorative designs that were based on the tenets of harmonious spacing and notan, which is a Japanese concept referring to the interplay between dark and light between compositional elements. Dow had established an influential summer art school in his hometown of Ipswich, Massachusetts, specifically to impart some of these methods and to give lessons in drawing and painting, woodblock printing, pottery throwing, and in 1900 a scholarship was established to send select Newcomb pottery artists to attend this summer school with Arthur Wesley Dow. And the result of his influence was seen very quickly in many of the Newcomb wares that were produced at this period. So for example, I'm showing, this is a vase from the Newcomb Art Museum on our left with a so-called Mississippi River design. You see, for example, the very high horizon line and the use of those sort of patterned clouds that follow an undulating pattern. They sort of retreat into the distance, very, very high on the neck of the vessel, adding that horizontal movement. We also know that a space-filling exercise that was published in Dow's textbook, this is in Composition, which featured several different approaches to depicting a grove of pine trees, proved especially influential among Newcomb potters. And there are several iterations of this pine tree motif framed within a horizontal register that were produced between about 1900 and 1905. Now, in this period of Newcomb pottery's history, the decoration developed a very distinctive style dominated by incised lines that were vertically banded into specific spatial divisions. And just to kind of give a technical note on how a piece like this would have been actually carved and then decorated, The decorator, so the Newcomb artist, the young woman who was working on this piece, would have taken the thrown vessel when it was basically in its greenware stage. So this is not yet fired, but still leather hard, we would call it. So it's dried, but not completely hard yet. And using a sharp tool, she'd be able to incise, basically carve those lines into the surface of the vessel, and then use underglaze colors, which are very, very paint-like, to apply the painted decoration. And then the entire vessel would then be covered in a higher firing glossy glaze, which gives it that incredibly sort of lip-smacking, colorful appearance that was so distinctive of the pieces of this time. Each piece would have been signed by its decorator using a distinct cipher on the bottom made up of her initials and marked with an NC for Newcomb College, which was an indication that it had passed the very rigorous vetting process that basically judged these pieces to be valid for sale. In 1902, we see a needlework and a metalwork class beginning at the Newcomb Art School, which added a new focus basically for the arts enterprise that was starting to really gain traction at Newcomb College. Professor Gertrude Robert Smith, who's pictured here standing at center, presided over this needlework program in which students learned to produce embroidered linen table runners and other domestic textiles, often incorporating motifs of southern pines and other designs that were inspired by those same botanical forms that were often found on Newcomb pottery. Now, in keeping with the philosophy that needlework could be, and in fact should be, and a very accessible skill for these young women, these artists and students, Smith had her students work primarily in these very simple stitches that were easily learned, and many of the students probably possessed before they even began learning to do this sort of needlework. So the darning stitch in particular was used very heavily in Newcomb textiles to a very particularly virtuosic effect. Darning stitch is essentially a very simple running stitch which is carried in and out of the fabric to form basically a line of stitches on either face of the fabric itself. And when it's executed in a straight line along the same axis as either the warp or the weft of the fabric itself, of the ground fabric, it can give the impression of actually being woven into the fabric itself, which is another very distinctive Newcomb needlework characteristic. Now, by 1915, the Newcomb enterprise was entering its 20th year of operation, and we begin to see a very dramatic shift in the appearance of pottery that was produced by Newcomb artisans. The art school had hired a ceramic engineer, Paul Cox, who introduced several new technical innovations to the pottery, and most importantly, or at least most importantly to the legacy of this design work, he developed a very new matte glaze, new to the Newcomb pottery artists, that is. A glaze that had a very satiny finish, which would almost completely supplant that previously used glossy glaze and come to dominate the pottery output, really for the remainder of the time that Newcomb pottery was produced. We also gradually began to see a more prescribed, a more codified appearance in the products of the Newcomb pottery. The dominant color tones shifted very dramatically to cool blues and greens, punctuated with only a very limited palette of perhaps pinks and yellows. And the very heavy, incised, thick lines of earlier Newcomb wares gave way to a much softer, more organic forms, which were now executed in a slight raised relief, with the overall matte glaze kind of softening the edges of the design and giving the surface this very misty, sort of atmospheric appearance. And this is the period when the so-called famous moon and moss motif first appeared, a dreamy, very atmospheric design scheme, which is meant to evoke the sultry Louisiana bayou. It's so popular, or becomes so popular among Newcomb clients that it became virtually emblematic of the pottery enterprise, and was really sort of the symbol of Newcomb pottery for the next 20 years. The production model at the pottery was gradually changing during these years. There's a greater emphasis on fulfilling orders placed by clients, perhaps over the individual proclivities of the artists. So we see a little bit of an increase in more, I would say, formulaic designs, more emphasis on that moon and moss. And this can also be attributed to a gradual drop in the number of decorators associated with the pottery at this period. In fact, between about 1918 and 1940, the overwhelming majority of Newcomb pieces, Newcomb ceramic pieces, I should say, were produced by really three artists, Anna Frances Simpson, Sadie Irvine, and Henrietta Bailey. Now, there are some interesting innovations that take place at Newcomb pottery in this later period. In 1925, the Newcomb art professor Mary Gibbon Shearer attended the International Exhibition of Modern Decorative Arts and Industrial Arts in Paris. This is the famed exhibition which introduced the world to the style moderne and gave us the term Art Deco. And when she returned, she really helped to usher in several new designs that were in keeping with this new geometric, sort of angular conventions of the new modern designs coming out of Europe. And so we do have evidence, for example, that this was carried out even in the metalworking studio. So we have some documentary evidence of at least one very ultra-geometric, ultra-modern dinner service produced by a metalworker from Newcomb College. By the 1930s, most of the original faculty of the college had retired, and the pottery officially ceased to operate in 1940. Newcomb artist Sadie Irvine did work with a pair of other ceramicists at the college to form a new production called what they called basically the Newcomb Crafts Guild. And they experimented with very innovative glazes and these very unique modern forms, producing some really truly beautiful work, although we can't necessarily consider these true pieces of Newcomb pottery in the strictest sense. Now, my own research on Newcomb pottery has focused much more so on the career and life of the Newcomb artist Harriet Joor, especially the years after she left her position at the pottery, which I propose provides a very useful case study for gauging the relative successes of the Newcomb enterprise on its own stated goal of encouraging employment for young women trained in the manual arts. So for the remainder of this talk, I'd like to concentrate on Joor's life and her work, both at Newcomb and her work after the Newcomb enterprise, with an eye for analyzing what that life can tell us about the lasting influence of Newcomb pottery. So Harriet Joor, or Hattie, as she was known to her family and friends, was born in 1875. She graduated from Newcomb College in 1895 with a Bachelor of Science degree, but she had a noted aptitude for art, and this led her to enroll in courses in pottery decoration offered by the college that same year. So she became one of the very first group of decorators to join the Newcomb pottery enterprise. Some of her very earliest ceramic vessels for Newcomb reflect that early experimental period for the pottery. We also know that she created one of the first Newcomb wares that was acquired by a museum collection. So this piece on the left was purchased by the Worcester Art Museum in 1903. She was also a participant in the needlework program. And while records that link individual artists to existing pieces of Newcomb needlework are quite rare, we do know of at least one piece in a private collection that's been at least tentatively attributed to Harriet Joor. And we know she was also one of the first students to attend Arthur Wesley Dow's Ipswich Summer School. She went for the first time in 1900 and returned at least once more in 1903. Under Dow's tutelage at Ipswich, she and her fellow summer students spent hours making sketches of local plant life, gathering material and inspiration for finished design products. So many of Joor's sketches from her summers in Ipswich are preserved in a group of papers which are now at the Hilliard University Art Museum in Lafayette. And studying these pieces has been particularly elucidating and fruitful, not only for identifying some precursors to later Newcomb pottery wares, in the case of this vase with a design based on blossoms and leaves of a trellis rose, or I should say a pillar rose on a trellis. But we're also able, through examining these drawings, to develop a deeper understanding of both the experience of being a student at Ipswich and also how a young woman like Harriet Joor may have been able to make key connections as an art student in New England. So just to illustrate, example, I'll give an example, comparing one of Harriet Joor's floral sketches for the stems and blossoms of a wild carrot plant, or Queen Anne's lace, which she made in Ipswich in July 1900. And let's compare this to a similar design by the ceramic artist Maud Mason, one of Joor's fellow students and friends, which was published in the journal Ceramic Studio. Now, we know that Mason produced at least one painted vessel that used this design as its basis, if you can see the piece that's on your far right. And it's edifying to compare this vase with another piece from that same decade, this one decorated by Sarah Gallner of the Paul Revere Pottery in Boston, pictured here at center. And to further compare these two ceramic examples with another work on paper from the Harriet Joor collection in Lafayette. This one, a repeated pattern, a sketch for an undulating pattern of Queen Anne's lace and stems, which is executed in black ink. Now, in terms of trying to draw sort of a conclusion about this popularity of a design motif among Arthur Wesley Dow's students, that might be a subject for another lecture, but for the moment I simply want to draw attention and underline these common motifs speak to the uniting ties of attachment to place and a shared aesthetics which were common among Arthur Wesley Dow's students. Many of these students were young women. They were destined for design careers. And for a Newcomb artist like Harriet Joor, these summers spent in New England may have functioned as really the true fulfillment of the stated promise of Newcomb and of the Newcomb enterprise. The opportunities that stemmed from this study may have been able to provide access to a larger outside world of professional contacts, for professional opportunities outside of New England. We know, for example, that Harriet Joor in 1905 did leave New Orleans. She moved to Chicago initially in 1905 at the age of 30. She took up a teaching position at the University of Chicago's University Elementary School, where she was teaching courses in clay modeling. She also maintained a very active private studio where she displayed examples of stenciled textiles, her own ceramic work. She also exhibited at the Art Institute of Chicago's Arts and Crafts Fair in 1908. And even before she had moved to Chicago, Harriet Joor began supplementing her income as a writer. And perhaps following in on that career path in 1905, she also began publishing stories in the Craftsman Magazine. Many of these were works of fiction. They were short stories that often centered on the lives of craftsmen and their sort of particular, unique inner lives. The Craftsman Magazine, of course, was originally conceived as a promotional organ for the business enterprise, the United Crafts, operated by Gustav Stickley, later renamed the Craftsman Workshops. Although the underlying motivations may have been very commercial in founding this magazine, it really eventually went on to become a major mouthpiece for the aesthetics and the philosophies of the arts and crafts movement in the early 19th and the early 20th century. In 1907, Joor was selected to contribute a group of textile designs to an article series in the Craftsman, which provided illustrated examples and instruction in the so-called home industrial arts. So drawing upon her experience as a Newcomb needlework artist, she designed a series of embroidered table runners and centerpieces, which, like typical examples of Newcomb needlework, were executed in silk threads, using simple running and darning stitches on very rough linen grounds. And many of the decorative motifs echoed those that were found in Newcomb embroidery and pottery. Now, these sorts of table runners were meant to be a part of the ideal craftsman interior as conceptualized in this illustration from the Craftsman in 1905, which you can see contains examples of pottery very much like which was being produced at Newcomb at the time, and a pierced brass lampshade, very, very similar to Newcomb wares. Only a few months after these designs appeared in the Craftsman magazine, they were actually offered for sale by Stickley's Craftsman Workshops. And so I have here a catalog from 1908 on fabrics and needleworks, in which Harriet Joor's designs were offered for sale. You could purchase these either as a furnished complete textile or as a kit. So in other words, you could purchase a length of linen that had the pattern stamped onto it, which you yourself could work out or execute yourself in the included silk embroidery threads. Now, these were some of the least expensive items that were for sale through Stickley's Craftsman workshops, which ties into an idea of the relative accessibility of needlework, both as a craft activity, but also as a piece of home furnishing. And this is a theme that we see echoed in some of Harriet Joor's later articles. She began writing in about 1910. This is an example of a finished Craftsman embroidery. Not very many of them are known to exist, and especially because they were sold in craft or in kit form, many of these are of questionable authorship, but there are a very few number that still exist. This is from the collection of Crabtree Farms. So in 1910, Harriet Joor began writing articles about basically providing tutorials for creating draperies, curtains, and other textiles used for home furnishings, giving instruction for women to be able to do these themselves, these projects themselves. These were published in publications as varied as Good Housekeeping, Country Life in America, The Women's Home Companion, International Studio. Not only did they provide these designs and helpful instruction, they also provided really a model for a particular time or a particular kind of female craftswoman, a very independent person who is able to create her home environment in her own image using economic materials and doing so in a very independent way. And while she was writing these design articles, Harriet Joor was in the midst of embarking on her own very dramatic enactment of the ideals of the arts and crafts movement. She was engaging in an experiment in living the so-called simple life as a homesteader in a very, very remote region of South Dakota. So beginning in about 1910, Joor lived in a cabin that was built from sawed bricks in a community made up of largely female homesteaders. Now, it's likely that this very dramatic departure from the cultured urban life she had previously enjoyed was a reflection of her desire to live what she called a retreat from the drudgery of city life, an opportunity to experience a cooperative living environment, a challenge to be able to beautify her very, very simple cabin there in South Dakota. And she wrote about her experience in 1910, saying, "All the deprivations of homesteading have seemed to me but a little price to pay for air that is clean and pure as golden wine, and sunlight straight from heaven, flooding plain and hill, the dim blue distances from the healing of weary eyes, and the big, blessed prairie silence for the healing of tired nerves." So just to conclude here, we have this very romantic, idyllic description of life as a homesteader, which frames the experience as a nostalgic return to the pioneer days, in which one is enabled to commune with nature, to work with one's hands using very simple materials. These are the preoccupations of many of the artisans and the tenets of the arts and crafts movement. And it's also the elements that we see and that many collectors observed in the wares of Newcomb pottery and continue to find so appealing about the products of the Newcomb enterprise. This focus on the handmade, associations with an unspoiled, bucolic version of the South that's steeped in a deep sense of nostalgia. To conclude here, I'll just mention that Harriet Joor only homesteaded for about 5 years. She eventually returned to Louisiana, decided she preferred the not-so-simple life. Although she lived for many years in Lafayette, she was a teacher at the Southwestern Louisiana Institute, which is now the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. There are many, many stories and like Harriet Joor's that really give us the full picture of how the artisans of Newcomb pottery went on to sort of engage with the larger movement of early 20th century arts and crafts. I've been able to do work with this particular figure, and it's my hope that I'll be able to continue doing that and that others will be able to continue doing so. And I look forward to future exhibition opportunities and research opportunities on this very special pottery enterprise. So thank you very much.